Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. My name is Alex, and we have actual stuff to talk about, an actual ball to talk about today on the show. No longer do I have to create wild scenarios about Eckler getting traded like I did in May or the draft, or talk up Max Duggan throwing the ball for some reason like I had to in the preseason, but we got real good stuff with Justin Herbert leading the way and this Chargers team attempting to make another shot at a Lombardi. So we'll be here all season doing bolt breakdowns. Specifically during the season after game number one, I will be covering everything after post game. So that will be every Monday, or if the game is on Thursday or Monday, then that'll be Tuesday or Friday. But there will be one episode of the show every week after the Chargers play their game, whether the result is a win or a loss. Some of you will probably be more excited to watch after a win, but I will be podcasting either way, rain or shine, nonetheless. So this is just the preview episode. So after every week after this, like I said, we will be doing the post-game show, and Tyler and Steven will be doing the pre-game kind of breakdown specifically. But thought, no game, this, week. So I figured I would do the pregame show instead. And then every week after I said, like, it'll be the postgame show. And I thought, for those of that were around during the Jags game that were, are not new subscribers to the channel, I thought I would wear this jersey again. This was the jersey I wore that night of the 27-0 lead. So trying to build some new karma, build some new energy, and get this thing going in the right direction. Let's Phillip Rivers' jersey wasn't the reason that we collapsed against the Jaguars, so we can rebuild again and have some happier memories in this jersey. And so hopefully that starts this week with the game against the Miami Dolphins. So obviously, I just wanted to start really quickly with the injury report, because that is, I guess, the thing that's of the most essence. Not the longest injury report for the Chargers, which I think most fans would take when you consider everything involved. Chargers just have two hamstring injuries. This is Wednesday's injury report, not Thursday's. But I'm pretty sure it'll be the same two names on the Chargers injury report to some degree when it does come out later today and later this afternoon. Dion Henley did not practice with a hamstring. He hurt himself against the Niners. That was kind of why the Chargers signed Tanner Muse to be a core 4 special teams linebacker like Dion kind of was in the preseason. So I think you'll see a lot of Tanner Muse, a lot of Nick Neiman if Dion Henley can't go, which I kind of expect to be the case at this point. If he is a DNP on Wednesday with a hamstring, I do think the Chargers will play it pretty conservatively. And the other hamstring injury is edge rusher Chris Rumph. He's a limited participant on Wednesday, so I think they're a little bit more optimistic that he can, maybe be a full practice by Thursday or Friday. But I think there's certainly, probably a better chance that he plays than Dion, as indicated by the Muse signing earlier last week. The Dolphins are in a little bit of a different position. They do have a lot of people on here, but it does start, I think, with Jeff Wilson Jr. and Jalen Ramsey, who, are more on long-term IR. Jeff Wilson Jr. for the first 4 weeks. Jalen Ramsey projected to come back sometime around December, but both of those players will be out for this game. You have a couple full participants, including Liam Eichenberg, Raekwon Davis, Connor Williams. Who else do we got? Salvin Ahmed and Davon A-Chain. So I would expect a lot of those players to play. The big pivotal injury for the Miami Dolphins with back, ankle, and knee injury, dealing with some stuff throughout the week, is Teron Armstead. And I think we'll kind of talk about some X's and O's specifically a little bit later, but obviously it doesn't take much to figure out that this becomes a really good matchup for Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack and that duo if one of the Dolphins starting tackles can't go. So I think that obviously doesn't take much of a genius to figure that one out. Also notable, Jalen Waddle is a limited participant in practice as of Wednesday with an oblique injury, but I think all signs are that they kind of expect him to play at this point, all things considered. The other thing that I thought I would bring up, just because I thought it was interesting, we talk about this being such a rematch of last year's game, and honestly, I feel like I memory hold how many of the Chargers players did not play in last year's version of the game. Probably because the Chargers won, and so I associate, a better Chargers performance with more guys available. But you really think back to it, and that Niners game that the Chargers played and the Dolphins game that the Chargers played, they were dealing with a lot of injuries. No Derwin James, no Bryce Callahan, no Sebastian Joseph Day, no Trey Pipkins, no Joey Bosa, no J.C. Jackson, no Rashawn Slater, no Jalen Guyton, no Austin Johnson, no Donald Parham in that game. And that's just kind of talking about, again, some of the real instant contributors that they felt like they were losing. And they had some clutch performances, I would say, in those guys' place. Kyle Van Noy had a pretty good game. That was the first kind of like game that Ja Taylor played really well. With down Bryce Callahan and down JC Jackson in that one. So, I think they had people step up in their place. But when we talk about kind of the scheme that the Chargers played, the amount of players that they were kind of missing actually makes it make more sense that they were able to kind of, make the Dolphins think a little bit more on a base level, because they kind of had to bet on the Staley two-man high scheme working with some manufactured pressures, because obviously they did not have their full defensive artillery out there, so had to, kind of throw some shit at a wall and hope it sticks to some extent. So now that the Chargers are, essentially the most healthy they're going to be the whole season, I'm very curious to see, again, how this game was going to go. So I just kind of want this to now be a little bit of general discussion at this point, X's and O's going back and forth. I think the thing to watch for in this game, honestly, is the Brandon Staley defense versus that Mike McDaniel offense in round two, so to speak. Mike McDaniel this week at his press conference laughed kind of when asked about the Brandon Staley plan to stop his offense last year. And the Chargers did have a lot of success against the Dolphins, even though this isn't a rematch. And both coaches would say these are different teams per se, both in terms of the personnel out there and the coordinators, right? Kellen Moore in for the Chargers on offense, Vic Fangio in for the Dolphins on defense. So certainly a much different functional year for both of these teams. And yet, the more things are different, the more they kind of stay the same, right? I do think to some extent what the Dolphins want to do on offense is not that different, right? I do think they'll try to be a little bit different about how they accomplish some of those things, but ultimately, they're kind of going to be living out of 11 personnel, with Tua trying to make accurate, quick read decisions to Tyreek Hill, to Jalen Waddle, whoever it might be. Obviously, Raheem Mostert, some dump offs in the flats, right? Like, I do think the goal is to still, kind of do some of the same stuff offensively. Obviously, they have to be a little bit craftier about how they do it, and I think they also maybe hope that in this game they can have a little bit more of a consistent ground game against the Chargers. They actually just, like, when you think about the run game last year, Miami just had some games where they didn't really use it against the Chargers, especially a Chargers defense that was kind of reeling at that point. And I'll be curious to see if that's more of an effort for Mike McDaniel to kind of assert this team this year, with a Raheem Mostert kind of attack, or whomever may be A-Chain, to kind of get some stuff out on the outside zone, because the Miami Dolphins were one of the best outside zone running teams last year, and the Chargers were one of the teams that defended outside zone the worst last year. So if you want to, like, kind of make a statement and try to say, all right, Brandon Staley, your run defense, can it finally defend the run here in your third year? I do think that would be a big statement for Mike McDaniel to make. And I also just think it makes it a lot harder to be able to just give those two high man looks to Tua and just do that all game, without, bringing guys down into the box, right? Kellen Moore said this at the press conference this week. It's sort of the idea of, do you run to set up the pass or do you pass to set up the run? And I think your offense becomes a lot more one dimensional if a team essentially can just kind of drop back and shell. And, if you can't run against shell, this is what Kellen Moore said at his press conference. It's just like, well, the team's going to stay in shell all day, right? And they're going to kind of let you, make that mistake in the passing game, or, just kind of force their way into whatever might be a turnover, or just have some, inconsistent passing intermediately. Some of the things the Dolphins kind of struggled with in that game against the Chargers, right? And you go back to that game, Raheem Mostert had 11 carries for 37 yards. Tua had 3 rushes for 28 yards, which I honestly don't even remember. But the Dolphins had these, like, they had these chunk plays that I think mattered from time to time, but they never got that consistent ground game presence. And when the Chargers, when you think of some of their worst defensive performances last year, a lot of it was the defenses on the field for a long time, and they are kind of getting beat into the ground by the run game, right? It was sort of the idea of, which offenses are going to make the Chargers bend and break the most. And so I think the Dolphins, the two things that they try to correct this game from an offensive standpoint are Tua being a little bit more accurate from the intermediate range, because there were some plays I remember one Kyle Van Noy pressure where he, he wasn't even like going to necessarily, come pressure Tua, but while Tua was, fixing to get a ball out into the flat, he just kind of like jumped in front of the route without really contesting it, and it just forced Tua's timing to be off a little bit, right? And so then that ended up being an incomplete pass to the flats. And I think Staley, at his press conference this week, said the thing that Tua's the best at, his elite trait is his timing, right? If you allow him essentially plays that are not perfectly covered, he is going to pick you apart. So the more defensive mistakes that you ultimately have, Tua is going to take advantage of those. Arjun had a stat in his Chargers analytics episode this week that said in terms of EPA per play, Tua is one of the best quarterbacks in the league when it comes to, again, his success against non-perfectly covered plays, right? If there's some sort of breakdown, Tua is going to find it, and, he'll get the ball out to Waddle or Hill, and, you can pay big time with a big play that just, burns you down the field. But alternatively, when everything is perfectly covered and there's, kind of less margin for error, that is where Tua is a little bit less explosive compared to some of his contemporaries, aka, Mahomes, Herbert, Allen, where the pocket breaks down and those guys can roll out to their left, roll out to their right, get a scramble, keep a play alive, or they can chuck a ball 60 yards, right? Tua is, again, very much you could call him a point and shoot quarterback in that sense compared to some of his more improvisational contemporaries. So I think from an offensive standpoint, that is kind of the idea, to just throw as many looks as you can at him and get as much pressure on him. Hopefully with Bosa and Mack, obviously you go to the Raiders game last year and that was their best game from a pressure standpoint when both of those guys were in their first game on the field together. That was the Khalil Mack 3-sack game. I think he might have won Defensive Player of the Week. So, I think they want to get after it early, in terms of the pressure, ramping that up onto it, especially with potentially no Teron Armstead. And I think, you want to make sure that you have as many plays perfectly covered. And so I do think this will be a little bit of a feeling out process, though, for both teams, especially given that it's a week 1-4 game, right, where both offenses are kind of trying to figure each other out, even though both of these coaches kind of have an idea of what to expect from each other, especially given the Staley Fangio familiarity. Shifting it over to, I think, the Chargers offense specifically, kind of, I think this offense is in a different place than I think it was when you look at last year, because really they had Keenan and Mike. Both were a little bit unhealthy by the time that game came around, right? But both actually had really good games. Keenan came up with some really good catches in that those final two quarters against the Dolphins. Mike Williams came up with some big plays too. Um, but it just felt like Justin Herbert. It was Justin Herbert, exhibition, right? Like it was everything that he does kind of perfectly, boiled down to its essence in terms of leading the offense and as many plays that were as tightly covered as possible. Justin Herbert still found that small window where he could complete a first down to Keenan Allen or any other kind of play. So I think that especially because the Chargers offensive line is in a much better place than it was that game. And you have Slater and Pipkins as your tackles. You have Lindsley, you have Zion, and you have Jamari. I do think early on there should be an emphasis to get some, deep shots in. Justin Herbert's kind of talked about this at the press conference where, nothing is terribly different in terms of taking deep shots. Obviously, there's a more real need to do it considering where the Chargers offense is and the rest of the teams that are in the AFC with their explosive offenses. But it's not like they didn't try to do it under Lombardi, right? The big problem was they had a lot of injuries last year and in years prior where it's like, okay, we kind of have to play based on what we're given, right? And if our offensive line is kind of in shambles and our blocking is really bad, then we're not going to have the ability to take consistent deep shots. So this is as healthy as the Chargers offensive line is going to be. This is as healthy as the Chargers receiving core is going to be. And so I think from Kellen Moore early on in this one, also the Dolphins dealing with some injuries in the secondary, including Ramsey. This is the game where I think you have to, get some of those deep plays to convert, especially going against the Dolphins who can complete some deep plays of their own. So without any further ado, I guess I'll also talk about one offensive player and one defensive player that I want to watch in this game. My offensive player is going to be Mike Williams. Mike Williams in the first 5 weeks of the season is a really hot, torrid player. I think if you look at the first halves of seasons, Mike Williams has averaged, I think last year, 80 to 88 yards per game. If you look at his back half of the season, he averages closer to 60 to 66 yards per game, right? So I do think, the injuries, the hits kind of rack up on his body later in the year, and he's a little bit more of an explosive player towards the beginning. We've seen that in the Cleveland Browns game from a couple of years ago. There's a couple of big in-season Mike games as a whole that happened early in the season that I think the Chargers are hoping to hit on, especially today. And this Dolphins secondary, especially minus Ramsey, it can be taken advantage of in terms of the amount of size that they're giving up to a bigger guy like Mike, a bigger guy like QJ if they want to call up a deep shot for him at some point. So I do think this kind of has to be, not has to be, but I do think this is an opportunity to really get a big Mike Williams game, considering the state of the Dolphins secondary, and you're probably going to have Xavier Howard kind of glued to the hip of Keenan Allen to some extent. And I think Keenan Allen will have a good game as well, but I'm looking for a big Mike Williams game to kind of get this offense going if I'm the Chargers personally. And on defense, I'm looking all at Khalil Mack. I think Khalil Mack came out firing, like I said last year. His first half of the season statistically was his best half of the season, particularly his first month, where he mostly played with Joey Bosa, and then Joey Bosa tried to come back towards the end of the season, but was already banged up. This is those two guys as healthy as they're going to be, and potentially going up against a Dolphins offensive line that does not have Teron Armstead. I think that is a huge advantage, massive advantage for this Chargers team. And so there's less of an ability to like chip block against Bosa and Mack in all those situations. So you're kind of going to have to throw your attention to one side or the other of the defensive line, and I'll be curious to see how the Miami offensive line handles that. But this is a lot of a good chance to get some quality pressure on Tua early, and I'm looking at Khalil Mack to kind of be the instigator of that more so than Bosa, because I think Bosa obviously is a tremendous pass rusher, but I think when you talk about like early season performances, I think Bosa is a little bit more focused on the run gaps and the run fits now. He is obviously going to be his own pass rushing self when the time comes. But I think Khalil Mack, early season Khalil Mack, that is who we can associate with a more explosive potential, not saying 3-4 sack game coming, but I do think a more higher outcome passing rush variance type game from him. So I'm looking for Khalil Mack to kind of potentially make that difference on defense. One thing I do want to mention also on defense, this was Brandon Staley's Wednesday press conference, where he did talk about the cornerback play, right? J.C. Jackson will play. The question is how much, right? So that's kind of what I'm interested to see from J.C. Jackson and that standpoint, and how the Chargers decide to manage that. I think it'll primarily be on the outside, but I do think the Chargers will kind of load manage his snaps, so to speak. J.C. Jackson, when talking to the media yesterday, said, "Oh, there's no limit on my knee." And then Brandon Staley was like, there's a little bit of a limit on your knee, essentially in his press conference, being like, we're going to monitor J.C. Jackson as we see fit. As they kind of tried to throw J.C. Jackson to the Wolves and get him going out the gate last year against Kansas City when he returned in week 2, and we saw how that went, where he wasn't quite as effective until that Seattle game, where he then got hurt last year. So I do think they will cool it a little bit in terms of bringing J.C. Jackson back. I don't think they're going to have him be quite a 90 to 95% of the snaps player like Michael Davis is going to be in the secondary, like Derwin James is going to be in the secondary. I think they'll play around with it. And one of the ways that I think they will play around with it is with Asante Samuel Jr. as well, right? They kind of have the ability to use him on the outside too. If J.C. Jackson needs to come out for a couple plays, right, and get a little bit of rest, then you can shift Asante Samuel Jr. obviously from the slot to the outside. And so now suddenly we're doing Asante Samuel Jr., Michael Davis on the outside, and then you have Ja Taylor or Derwin James, right, at slot corner at that star position. So I think the Chargers will play around with that. So that's kind of my last defensive note. I'll be curious to see what the J.C. Jackson and Asante Samuel Jr. snaps and positions look like in this game. With that said, without any further ado, I do have my game prediction. I thought about this one all week, and maybe it's just the week 1 hype getting to me, but I do have the Chargers winning this game 26-23 over the Dolphins. I think the Chargers, have the, right pieces and are a little bit more healthy than the Dolphins are right now. I think that partially plays into it, but I think they have a pretty good system to be able to stop Tua and that, torrid Miami offense that is a little bit one-dimensional in nature. If you have a guy that can at least kind of keep up with Tyreek Hill, and we associate that with, I think, Michael Davis being able to do that, and they have the rest of the flexibility in the secondary, including Derwin James, I think, to sort of be able to slow down the rest of their receivers. So I think they have the tools and the ability to slow down the Miami offense. I don't know if it'll be quite as successful as last time. I do have the Dolphins scoring 23 points relative to the 17 that they scored last time, and I think it'll be 23 real points. Remember, there was a Tyreek Hill fumble recovery touchdown in Miami's scoreline last time, so I do think they probably get some more real offensive touchdowns and offensive scores in this game. But I do have the Chargers coming out on top. I think they are, again, like I said, a little bit healthier right now. I trust that they are actually, especially with everybody healthy, going to get some more true deep shot potential against this Miami secondary that does have a couple holes in it right now, especially with Jalen Ramsey out. And I think this is the perfect type of game for Mike Williams, for Keenan Allen, to really have a big game with Justin Herbert. And I see the Chargers taking care of business. Hopefully I am right, and we are celebrating a Chargers win in the post-game show. If I'm not right, I will still be here. I know some of you guys disappear after a loss and, don't watch the pod quite as much, but rain or shine, whatever it is, hell or high water, I will be here after the Chargers either win or lose when we talk on Monday morning during the post-game show. But I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Bolt Breakdowns. I will see you guys next time. And as always, bolt up, fuck the Dolphins.